They thought I'd never come back. While I was serving overseas, my quiet neighborhood HOA made a decision that would change everything. They sold off the very land I had poured my savings into, claiming I'd abandoned it. But when I returned home, I didn't just find my property gone. I found an entire community that believed they could erase me with paperwork. What they didn't expect was that I'd use the very resources they overlooked to turn their world upside down. So, how do you fight back when an entire HOA tries to steal your life's work? Life in the neighborhood always seemed picture perfect on the surface. Families walked their dogs in the evening, kids biked down neatly paved sidewalks, and the lawns looked like they were clipped with surgical precision. To an outsider, it was the kind of community that promised safety, order, and pride of ownership. For me, it was more than just a neighborhood. It was home. I had invested every bit of savings into my property, carefully planning not just for the present, but for the future I wanted to build there. The house itself wasn't extravagant, but it carried meaning. Every corner held reminders of hard work, of sacrifices made, of a dream slowly taking shape. Neighbors smiled and waved. Barbecues happened on weekends. It was the kind of place where people exchanged holiday cards and pretended problems didn't exist. But underneath that calm exterior, there was something else. A set of rules, whispered gossip, and an invisible pressure that every homeowner eventually felt. The HOA didn't just oversee the neighborhood, it controlled it. From the color of your shutters to the height of your grass, nothing escaped their watchful eyes. At first, I brushed it off as normal, part of living in a well-kept community. But then small cracks began to show. Notices slipped under doors. Strange comments about compliance and abandoned property started circulating. And before long, I realized that what I thought was my safe investment was quietly being pulled out from under me. Inside the community clubhouse, the tone was different from the smiling sidewalks outside. Meetings were stiff, rules rattled off like scripture, and the same few people held all the power. Richard Coleman, the HOA president, stood at the podium like a self-appointed judge, smug in his navy blazer with the gold pin gleaming on his chest. He spoke about community standards and shared pride, while his board nodded along, their judgmental eyes scanning the room. The hall itself was nearly empty. Rows of vacant chairs, proof of how little the rest of the neighborhood wanted to be there. It started small, the way so many of these stories do. A letter slipped into my mailbox. Not even a formal one, just a folded sheet of paper with the HOA's letterhead stamped across the top. At first, I thought it was a simple reminder about lawn care or trash collection, the kind of thing you barely glance at before tossing aside. But this one was different. It stated that my property had been noted as out of compliance, and that continued absence from the residents could trigger further review by the board. I remember holding that paper in my hands, staring at the line that read continued absence. The ink seemed to blur for a second, my chest tightening. I wasn't absent, I was deployed. My house wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. I was serving thousands of miles away, and somehow that was being used against me. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I sent an email to the HOA explaining that I was overseas, that my mortgage was paid, that my family name was still on every document. I expected understanding, maybe even a note of appreciation. Instead, weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was harsher, colder, wrapped in the language of bureaucracy. It stated that because I was not maintaining residency, the HOA had the right to initiate proceedings to reclaim the land for community development purposes. I tried to brush it off. Surely they wouldn't dare. But the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive, each one hinting at consequences, fines for neglect, warnings about failure to respond in person. They even sent someone to take photos of the property, snapshots of my perfectly intact home, framed to look like it was deteriorating. I'd hear about it through neighbors, who whispered nervously about how the board was concerned. And then came the knock on the door, not mine, but my neighbor's. The HOA representative walked up in broad daylight, clipboard in hand, announcing loudly that the property next door was under review. My neighbor, a kind man who'd always waved when I left for work, called me overseas, his voice uneasy. "They're circling like vultures," he said. "They keep asking who really owns your place. It's like they're planning something." I tried calling the HOA directly. I left voicemails, I wrote letters, I even had a friend deliver documentation showing that my mortgage and taxes were up to date. None of it mattered. Every reply I got back was the same. Cold form letters, unsigned, always referencing community bylaws and unclaimed property. Weeks turned into months and the threats escalated. The HOA slapped my property with fines for overgrown grass, though a neighbor had been mowing it for me. They claimed my fence was in disrepair, even though it stood perfectly fine. And then, without warning, they hit me with the most crushing blow, a notice that my land had been sold. I read the word over and over, trying to process it. The HOA had taken it upon themselves to declare my property abandoned, seize it, and sell it off, all while I was still actively paying for it. It was theft, dressed up as legality. They had the audacity to say it was in the best interest of the community. Felt rage like I had never felt before. Not just anger at losing what I had worked for, but betrayal. This was supposed to be home. This was supposed to be safe. And yet, very people entrusted with maintaining order, gutting me alive through paperwork and technicalities. Here's the thing about people who think they've outsmarted you. Always underestimate what you're capable of. Because while the HOA thought I was powerless overseas, they had overlooked one critical detail. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was serving in the military, and I had access to channels they could never even imagine. I started making calls, quiet ones at first. I gathered every document I had, every email, every letter with their signatures and stamps. I contacted military legal support, explaining how an HOA had essentially stolen a deployed service member's property. The response was immediate. That's not just wrong, that's illegal. But even as I built my case, the HOA kept pressing forward. They moved quickly, trying to legitimize the sale, pushing paperwork through county offices. They thought the clock was ticking against me, that by the time I came home, it would be too late. And that's when I realized I couldn't just wait. I had to act now. The HOA board thought they had me cornered. On paper, my land was gone, my name erased, and their narrative of community preservation neatly tied up with a bow. They had grown comfortable in their arrogance, confident that a soldier thousands of miles away couldn't possibly dismantle their power. But what they hadn't counted on was the speed and reach of the very system they ignored. When the military legal office took my case, it didn't just stall their little scheme, it triggered something much bigger. They hadn't just stolen from a homeowner, they had stolen from an active duty service member under federal protection. And that meant this wasn't just civil paperwork anymore, this was federal jurisdiction. It started with silence, the kind that comes right before a storm. The HOA filed another motion with the county to push their claim through, but instead of rubber stamping it, the clerk froze the process. Days later, board members were served with legal notices. They had no idea that every letter they had ever mailed me, every fine they fabricated, every newsletter dripping with falsehoods, had been compiled into a case file thicker than any binder they'd ever slammed shut at a board meeting. And then came the day that changed everything. It was supposed to be routine for them. Another board meeting in the community hall, filled with the usual smug faces and murmured gossip. They expected neighbors to sit quietly, nodding along as they explained why my property had been reclaimed for the greater good. What they didn't expect was the sight of uniformed officers walking through the doors. At first, the room went quiet, then whispers started, chairs creaked. The board president tried to keep his voice steady as he stammered through an agenda item, pretending nothing was wrong. But the illusion shattered when one of the officers laid a thick folder on the table, my case file, and announced in front of the entire community that the board was under investigation for fraudulent seizure of property belonging to a deployed service member. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, neighbors turning to each other with wide eyes. The same people who had quietly believed the board's lies now watched them squirm under the weight of something they couldn't bully, fine, or intimidate away. The board president's face flushed red as he tried to protest, his words stumbling into incoherence. This must be a misunderstanding, he insisted, gripping the edge of the table. But the evidence was undeniable. The forged photos, the falsified fines, the misused bylaws twisted into weapons. Piece by piece, their empire of control was laid bare for everyone to see. For months, they had painted me as the absentee, the one who abandoned the neighborhood. But now, in front of the entire subdivision, the truth rang out. They were the thieves. They were the liars. They were the ones who had gambled on power and lost. And the humiliation didn't stop there. The officers didn't just serve papers. They read portions of the complaint aloud. Neighbors heard how the HOA had mocked my deployment in private emails, calling it an opportunity to seize land. They heard how the board had fabricated neglect claims while neighbors volunteered to keep my property clean. They heard how the HOA had pocketed funds from the sale before the transaction was even legally complete. Every detail was like a nail in the coffin of their credibility. I wasn't in that room physically. I was still deployed, watching from afar, but I didn't need to be there to feel the shift. I could picture it clearly. The board members' smug expressions crumbling, the power draining from their posture, the murmurs of neighbors growing louder with every revelation. For the first time, the board wasn't the one dictating the narrative. They were trapped under the harsh light of truth, exposed before the very people they had ruled with arrogance. The president tried one last time to salvage control. He stood slamming his fist on the table, declaring that the HOA was within its rights and that outsiders had no authority in community affairs. But the words died in his throat when the officers calmly explained that this wasn't just a community issue anymore. It was a federal violation, and that meant the HOA's shield of bylaws and fine print was useless. Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating silence. In that moment, the board wasn't feared anymore. They were pitied. Exposed, broken, and as the meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors demanding answers, officers taking statements, and the board shrinking into their seats, I knew the war had turned. They had tried to strip me of everything, but instead they had stripped themselves bare. Fallout was swift, but it wasn't simple. When the officers walked out of that board meeting, they didn't just leave behind a shaken HOA, they left behind an entire neighborhood questioning everything they thought they knew.